Hi there, my name is Philip and Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, I'm joined by my Art of Procurement colleague, Helen Mackenzie. So Helen and I were both at ProcureCon EU together in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago. And so what I thought we'd do today is just sit down and have a chat about our reflections on the event. And we may also just chat a little bit about the broader conference season over the last few months. So first of all, Helen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Phil. It's a pleasure to be on with you. I think it's my first time, so there we go. Lovely to be on.
I was thinking that as well. You know, obviously you do the Procurement 6 with Kelly and I every, I think 3 weeks or so, but the first time that we've actually had a chat directly. So this is fun.
Great. Happy to be here.
So let me start off just by asking you, and I know it's kind of a broad question, but you spent a lot more time in the content sessions at ProcureCon EU than I did. So what were some of your observations as you went in and out of all the different sessions?
Okay, well, I mean, I think the topics weren't that surprising given, you know, where we are in the world and where procurement is in that context. You know, you'd got topics like leadership, sustainability, using technology, and a broader questions about cost increases and inflation. So, you know, in that sense, the agenda wasn't a surprise. But some of the topics that were covered in the sessions were interesting, refreshing different points of view on some themes that, you know, we've been talking about in procurement for a number of years. So on day one, for instance, Dominic Lebigeau, who's the CPO at Louis Vuitton, he gave quite a powerful exposition of the procurement model in terms of the relationship with suppliers. And, you know, this is something that we know, but it's always helpful to hear it from a slightly different angle. So he used degrees. So he talked about 90-degree relationships with suppliers being that transactional, traditional relationship that we have with them. The 180-degree relationship being around business cooperation. And an example that he gave there was during the pandemic, working with some of their suppliers to actually supply them with bottles, because one of the things they produce is things like champagne. They've got bottles. Some of their suppliers do that as well. So that sort of partnership approach. And then the sort of 360-degree relationship, which I think we've heard, you know, a number of times on the Art of Procurement pod now, about business amplification, about working together, innovating together. And he introduced quite an interesting idea about collective intelligence, where he talked about working with suppliers to understand that ecosystem beyond tier one in the supply chain, you know, right down to startups and innovation in the supply chain, through to what the procurement and the suppliers are doing now. So that was quite an interesting topic, and I don't know whether that's something that you've heard at any of the other conferences that you've been at this year, just in terms of that model for procurement.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say, like going in the beyond tier one. And I think you talked about startups as well. And there's a couple of things that come to mind on that. One is, you know, this recognizance that, and this has been talked about at some of the other events, you know, the need to know deep into your supply chain, because we talked about this for a long time, you know, supply chain risks. There's often single points of failure that you're not aware of because you only see a tier one or even a tier two, but the single point of failure may actually be tier 3 or tier 4 supplier. So we've definitely heard a lot of talk, and there's been a lot more focus, I think probably driven by the pandemic. But the other thing you said there was around, you know, understanding startups and small businesses. Now, there are larger companies, you know, do a decent job of that. We've talked on the pod about what BT Source does from their procurement garage. Ironically, I'm actually in New York right now as we record this, and a few years ago I had the chance to go to a Techstars incubator in New York, which was sponsored by Barclays. So Barclays had a lot of fintech small businesses and startups were in a kind of a controlled accelerator and incubator, if you will, for new business for small businesses. There's this opportunity for us to in the key categories, and it doesn't need to be just big businesses that do this, to understand who are the emerging players. You can be a smaller organization, but you have 2 or 3 major categories. You can really or should be looking deeper at where the new innovation is coming from. Who are the suppliers that you can build formative relationships with at the very beginning? How can you create favorable contracting in terms of conditions so you can work with those on pilots? And that's where you get a lot of really interesting innovation that's probably gives you a competitive advantage when you're a smaller business rather than just being the big business. So it's interesting to hear that being talked about now, because I think it kind of got lost a little bit over the pandemic as everyone's just focusing on how to make sure we have the product that we need tomorrow.
Absolutely. And I think that links very much, that idea about smaller suppliers and innovation links very much into day 2 of the event, where sustainability was the agenda theme.
Mm-hmm.
And, there was a lot around the usual topics, decarbonisation, ethical sourcing, and so on, but also some interesting ideas that were a little bit different from what I'd heard before. For instance, Paul Harrington, who was the keynote speaker, who's the CPO of TUI, which is a holiday company, travel company. He talked about not actually setting targets for sustainability, which I thought was quite interesting. And he was saying, reflecting on targets driving behaviour and that not necessarily being helpful. He didn't say that we shouldn't be measuring outcomes in procurement, but he did suggest that actually having clear principles that we'd use in supplier selection processes, in the questions that we'd ask in that process, would be a lot more helpful than a target that said we needed to have a particular characteristic of supplier, for example, women-owned or smaller business and so on. So that was quite interesting. The other comment that stood out for me was from Rory Lamont, who's the CPO of Hitachi Rail Systems, and that was in a panel discussion. And he talked about building a procurement team that will understand what they need to do to motivate supply chains to change and decarbonise. So, in the transport industry, in the rail industry, I think they've got a lot of momentum and also pressure to decarbonise what they do, particularly around this rolling stock and tracks and so on. And he was really hinting that capability in the team, so that they could motivate suppliers, that partnership again with suppliers to make the change, was a really important part of sustainability. So not just understanding what the issues are, but actually having the capability to be creative and work with suppliers as well. So that was an interesting point.
Yeah. So it's like we become the coach ultimately of our suppliers, as opposed to just kind of dictating terms on them, actually partnering them to help them understand how they can help us. And that's a different approach for how we brought up in procurement, isn't it? Because we brought up in procurement to almost say, here's the contract, now we're going to kind of point fingers at it to make sure you deliver against the contract, versus we're kind of going to figure this out together. And there's obviously mutual benefit for doing it.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I've seen a lot of in that space is not only market shaping, because often you're going to the market for a more sustainable solution and it's just not there. So actually you've got to work with suppliers to shape the market to be able to respond to the requirement that you're going with. And I think that is about that relationship building, but also that partnership. And that's where different forms of contracting might come in, where you're looking at focusing on outcomes that you can achieve together, back to that 360 view of things, rather than, as you say, that very sort of transactional, we'll specify what we want, you'll deliver it type of thing. Now that's harder. There's more risk around that, I think, and people will feel that's more a more frightening way to go to the market. So frightening is perhaps a bit extreme, but a more difficult way to go to the market, something that might take a bit longer, something that you might need to talk to legal about because you need to get the shape of what you're going with right. But actually, if the outcomes that you and the business want to achieve, which is decarbonisation in the respect of the rail company, but sustainability or diversity in suppliers, if that's your objective, then you've got to be more imaginative about what you do, and also get the guardrails about that, so that you can actually take some risk and be a bit more innovative.
So it's interesting you talked about the CPO from TUI, who was making the case for perhaps we don't need metrics around sustainability, and I do think that that's kind of the missing link at the moment, is that nobody's really sure on how to manage and measure impact regard to sustainability and some of the other ESG related initiatives. Now I know that sustainability was a big focus for you, in your prior role as a CPO in regional government. So what's your view from a sustainability perspective of targets versus no targets, or how to ensure that you're kind of doing the right thing?
Well, I think it comes down to this idea about lead and lag indicators that I talk about a little bit in our own work in Art of Procurement. There's something about process and not necessarily knowing what the outcome's going to be in the short term. And something like sustainability is a prime example of that. So I think that you've got to focus, and I think that this is what Paul was getting at in his keynote. You've got to focus on process and then see how the results pan out, because you just can't tell how it's going to be. So his point was about making sure that he'd got a diverse supplier on a long list in an RFP process. Now, that doesn't mean that that particular supplier will win. They might not even get on the shortlist, but in terms of a process, that was something that he could do. And that's certainly something that we did in my old role, was to make sure where we knew there was a smaller supplier or a local supplier or a supplier with diverse characteristics that were important to our government and our politicians, that they were proactively invited to apply. Also, the way that we framed the requirement that we went to the market with actually meant that they could participate. So I think there's something there about, again, the inputs and being very intentional about that. But whether they win or not is down to them, down to what they've got to offer, down to how they price it, and down to how, that value translates into their proposal and how it stacks up against everything else. So I think that's what Paul was saying, and that's what I would always say, is that you can set the conditions with your lead indicators, but that might not necessarily mean your lag indicators are coming out in the right way, in the sense of setting a target. But it's a much better, a more effective way to run things than sort of keeping your fingers crossed for, I don't know, a decarbonisation target.
Right.
You might not hit till 2030 or something like that. That at least you can see if you're being successful using the strategies that you've come up with.
So what was day 3 all about?
Okay, well, day 3 was a bit more nuts and bolts in terms of procurement. It was cost increases, inflation, and all that jazz. And there was quite an interesting panel that I've picked out a few quotes from, where the CPOs there were talking about strategies that their teams had come up to deal with price increases and increases in cost. And Herman Lancer was there from Air France, and he actually suggested that one of the things that they'd done was to come up with an alternative, so a make solution rather than a buy solution, that gave them a bit of leverage. And that was around chip manufacturers, actually. That was quite interesting, that they'd gone down the road of trying to repurpose or refurbish chips that they used, rather than being stuck in that position where they couldn't get chips, or the chips that they needed were going to cost them, double, treble what they were used to. So that was interesting. Fernando Duro from Repsol talked about really doubling down on process and data. So he and his team had got really into the contracts, knowing the contracts, being really clear what was in them, being really clear about like segmentation of suppliers, about who was important, who were the bottleneck suppliers and so on, the critical suppliers, and then having a very clear roadmap for the negotiations. And those would be negotiations both in the short term when these price increases and inflation came in, and also longer term in terms of, were they setting things up that they knew that were going to go to market as soon as they could, or that they were engineering a deal with supplier where they knew that they would be staying with them for longer term. And Elena Fontan from Roche was the other one that stuck out for me. She's on the indirect side, so a lot of professional services, specification, statement of work driven contracts in her area. And she was talking about focusing on outcomes and then really looking at what, the pricing was coming back, what they were buying, and where things could be trimmed. So, for instance, she talked about, say, project management, where perhaps you'd be buying a monthly governance meeting where hours would be charged from consultants. And did that really need to take place? Where was the risk if that didn't happen, and could that be trimmed? So, quite practical discussions there about what people were doing. And actually, the questions from the floor pressed those panel members to be very specific. People wanting to know, well, what did you do? It's all right talking at a high level about strategy, but what did you do in practice?
Now that kind of segues in, I think, to a roundtable that we did. So on the second day, we were running a roundtable in partnership with Procurement IQ that was all around inflation management. So it was called Inflation Management: How to Use External Information Sources to have to manage inflationary pressures. In category management. And we set out. We thought we'd probably have a small table of 12, 13 folks, and ended up having kind of standing room only, which was really interesting because we could get so much different perspectives from a number of different companies. And there were a lot of folks who were, there were companies of all sizes, and there was direct folks as well. So I thought we could just talk a little bit about what we heard in this roundtable, because what we ended up doing, because of the number of folks there, is that Helen and I both took a table, along with one of our partners from Procurement IQ took a table as well. So we had really 3 different roundtables all going on at the same time. And I kind of kicked things off at the beginning with a bit of a pulse check. I asked everybody the volume of cost increase requests that you have been seeing. Basically, is it slowing down, or is it moderating, or is it still accelerating? And honestly, I was surprised by the results. I'm not sure if I should have been surprised by the results or not. I thought that things were moderating now, but across the room, there was general consensus that it's certainly not slowing down, and cost increases continue to come in every single day. Was that what you heard in your conversations?
Yes, and I think that in a sense there's catch up in terms of perhaps businesses, suppliers that have been able to cope with increases, to cover increases, because potentially that they thought that they might be short term. So if we think about, particularly in Europe, the situation in Ukraine, supply chains around that, I think that, possibly some suppliers didn't think that so many months down the line we'd still be where we were. Got somebody I was speaking to was in the fertilizer business, and obviously that's been significantly hit with supply chain difficulties, and now they're really having to get to grips with all of that. So I think that's what's happening from a European perspective, is some of the things people thought were a short-term blip actually are now here to stay for a little while. And as we're approaching winter as well, where things like energy costs are bound to increase, then that's where suppliers have had a look at things and said, we perhaps need to pass this on to our customers in terms of a price increase. And that's where it's coming through. So yeah, it was interesting because there was actually one person from a country that's had quite a lot of high inflation for a while, and they were just saying, welcome to our world. But I think,
Right.
generally speaking, most people have come from countries and areas where inflation has been low. So this is quite a difficult time for them.
Yeah, and from a US perspective, what I'm seeing right now is it's very category specific. So, you had this period of time where cost increases were hitting everything, and now it's probably not unsurprisingly, it is very based upon category by category. And so, for example, chips, we talked about chips earlier, and I think I talked 2 or 3 months ago with the CEO of Lever Data on the podcast about, we're now going to go into a glut. And so that's happened. And now we've got a glut in chips. Now the prices are tumbling. You have container freight prices from China to the US. They've gone down, I think, from above 20 grand a container to 2 grand a container. So you're having like hyper deflation now in certain categories, but it's certainly very inconsistent across categories based on the specific situations, which is actually a little bit more manageable than everything getting cost increases from everywhere.
Yeah.
Now, one of the questions that we asked everybody in the roundtable was, do you have a formal process for determining whether or not to accept a cost increase request? What was the general consensus on your table?
I think, well, some didn't, and certainly a lot didn't at the beginning of the process. I think of this period. In fact, I think that people had dealt with them from time to time, but nothing particularly mapped and formal. But now most have, and that was interesting to see that people were using the processes back to this short and long-term perspective that I spoke about earlier. Some were using the process to buy a bit of breathing space. Another were using it as a more fundamental review of the cost structure of the contract. So, but yeah, I was surprised actually. So certainly coming from government procurement, where we have quite a regimented process around contracts,
Yeah.
and it's not about negotiation at the table particularly. I thought that in business, price increase requests and toing and froing would be a lot more prevalent than actually it appeared to be on the table that I was facilitating.
Yeah, and I had similar experiences on the table that I was on. I asked, why did you find that? And I think that there was bandwidth was a big issue. We just had so many that we didn't have the opportunity to do the due diligence that we may have wanted to have done, or we had to pick and choose. Some other responses were related to, it depends on if we felt that we could push those increases onto our customers. Because there was generally accepted inflation in a particular category or not. And so actually it was an opportunity to increase prices, or to if it was pass through, there was less due diligence around negotiating those cost increases than if it wasn't pass through. I think that as we got further and further into this, more did have a process. Those processes were pretty inconsistent. What I see as being best practice is really understanding the input costs that are driving the cost increase request. So if you start to talk about, we're increasing our pricing by X because oil price has increased by Y, or some other commodity, or maybe there's wage rate inflation, something that is justifiable, that can be connected with a particular publicly available metric, then that creates much more of a transparent based conversation around the validity of an increase, versus it just being, hey, we're going to increase our price 5%, and there's not, it's really arbitrary.
Yeah, and I think certainly the people around my table that had the categories where they'd done the work on the cost drivers would understand it. There was one particular example where that was shared, where the supplier came with a 10% price increase request, and the procurement lead there, she was able to push back and say, well, I hear what you say, but the inflation that you're talking about only represents sort of 4% of your input costs. So try again, please, in terms of your request. So I think certainly that whole idea of cost drivers and the structure of the cost of what you're buying has come to the forefront now. And I think, as you say, even if people are only using publicly available data around inflation in particular categories, that has become more prevalent in terms of the way that people think about how they look at these price increases now, definitely.
Yeah. And we talked about using should cost analysis, and I would say that most of the folks on our table who were in the direct material space could talk about using cost estimating or should cost analysis. So at least kind of were familiar with the concept. Those that had responsibility for indirect, it was a little bit more, I don't know, 50-50, or there wasn't that much, it wasn't as prevalent as the use of should cost analysis, which to me is a really missed opportunity. Because at the end of the day, input costs, you can track the input costs for both a direct material and an indirect service. Yes, your providers may be pricing direct materials more on the input cost base, and a service is probably priced more on value. And so there's not a direct correlation between input costs and the cost of a service. When you're talking about increases, I think there's more of a closer connection. So I think that's a missed opportunity for anybody who's in the indirect services space who isn't using should cost analysis, that there's an opportunity to do that and at least put data on the table that your provider can push back on. But when they push back on it, that provides the opportunity to actually be a lot more open in discussing, well, what should it be then?
Yeah. And I think also there's a lot more publicly available data. I think about some of the job sites that compare salaries, for instance. So if you're doing a should cost, you're building a should cost model for service provision, you might be able to work out how much particular people that might work on delivering the service for you would cost. That actually it's a little bit easier to try and do that now than perhaps it was in the past, where some of this information wasn't as readily available. I think the other thing is where providers are quite big dominant providers. Let's talk about, I don't know, cloud storage, for instance, where quite big dominant providers, where even the biggest companies don't feel like they've got that much leverage to change pricing and to push back on price increases. But just understanding that, being able to do some benchmarking, thinking about demand. So there was a lot on the indirect side about trying to think about demand. So how much, back to cloud storage, how much cloud storage do we need? How many licenses do we need for IT, et cetera, et cetera. So trying to come at it from a number of ways when you're building that cost model actually does help you perhaps for the future when you have got that breathing space to think about perhaps changing providers or to go into the market for a slightly different solution.
And the topic that I want to just touch on last in today's pod that we asked was, how can we ensure that how can we ensure that when the input costs decrease, that we're reversing any cost increases that were granted? Did you have anybody on your table that had a proactive way for doing that?
I think other than having a flag on that contract and that supplier and understanding which metrics you were monitoring to prompt going back to the supplier, probably not. And also that short-term, long-term perspective where price increases were agreed for a particular period of time so that there was that trigger to go back. There wasn't anything particularly innovative from my own table that came back on that. But what about yourself, Phil? Was there anything on yours that was interesting to report?
I think that there was one or two people who talked about, when I talked about earlier about, finding a publicly available index to index an input cost against something that's publicly available from an information perspective. And then as that index changes, adjusting the price accordingly. And that's an interesting one for me, because I think as procurement folks, we've been brought up because what that leads to is a lot of variability in pricing, as the index changes.
Mm-hmm.
And in procurement, we've been brought up to, or at least I have, to want to have budget certainty and to have fixed cost, like a fixed price, so that you know what the fixed price is going to be, in 12 months' time, even in 24 months or 36 months, based on the pricing and the pricing mechanisms in the contract. And therefore, our stakeholders can have that certainty when they're doing all their budgeting. And when you continue to have regular changes, then it impacts the budgets of your stakeholders. And maybe it means that they can't go and do something they had planned in the budget, or they've got to go back and ask for more money. The feeling was that because these inflationary pressures are so well known, outside of the procurement office, that there's a growing acceptance that we might have as organizations have to put up with that unknown pricing, because you're connecting it to an index, but that at least gives you some confidence that you're not going to be overpaying, that you're kind of buying with market. So go ahead, Helen.
No, I was just going to say, and I think that links very much to that relationship with finance, with the CFO or the finance business partner, whoever you're working with, to really work through what the variability, what the risk is around that, so that they can then think about their appetite for risk. Because I think a lot of the time we are second guessing what the CFO wants. Does the CFO want cost certainty in terms of them building out the model for the business, the cash flow, etc., or does the CFO want something different? So I think there's definitely merit in talking to finance and just running through what the options are around that, seeing what one might work for them. Because if they understand how you've priced it, what the risk might be around that, and they've got an early warning system, even if it's just you warning them, then that decision could be made in the bigger context of the business's finances and the overall financial strategy. So I think there's something around that that's quite interesting around this as well.
Yeah, it's funny you say about us not necessarily knowing what a CFO wants, because it's a topic we covered last week, isn't it, at Mastermind Live, with a CFO around procurement's our assumptions of what is important is not necessarily important. With the best practices around input costs, and making sure that we're able to recover increases should prices go back down, that I've seen is really when you're accepting a cost increase, you're accepting it as a short surcharge rather than the price has changed. When we put in the system now the new price, and the new price is the new price forever. So putting it in place as more of a surcharge then allows you to have a governance program around reviewing whether that should still be the case or not. And so therefore, when it isn't, there's a mechanism to reduce your price. Because I know that that's one of the things that a lot of organizations struggle with, is they give the cost increase, and because there's so many other things going on, you can forget about it. And it's only 2 or 3 years down the line when you're going back out to market, or a contract is expiring, or perhaps there's a big corporate-wide cost savings drive, that you actually start to recover some of those. And the suppliers benefited from 2 or 3 years of higher cost when the input costs actually decreased.
Yeah. And I think an interesting example as well, just around that, was about how you can use that to perhaps develop and strengthen the relationship with the supplier. So one of the people around the table talked about conversations where they said this negotiation, this discussion isn't about your margin. Your margin is your margin. That's what you've got in the contract. So let's look at ways where we can work with this increase to put that through, but also recognizing that the decrease would come, but that's not going to be at the expense of their margin. And I think that was something that was quite interesting around a win-win sort of approach. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I think we do need to be extremely switched on about how we remind ourselves about these things. There's plenty of technology there that can ping something up in the inbox on a particular date to see if a price has changed, through to technology that will link to indices that would automatically tell us if the price of something had gone down. So I don't think we've got a lot of excuse to forget about it. But back to what you said at the beginning, given the volume of changes that requests for change, requests for increase that people have had through it, possibly is quite difficult to keep track of it all. But that I think that's really interesting about. And I don't think our stakeholders will let us off if we forget, Phil.
Right.
Now, I just don't think it's. I think they'd probably be not very pleased if we'd not had a system to keep track of something in the contract which said that we would take the price down if the price changed. So I think we've got to be really on the front foot around this. However, we remind ourselves that the price has gone down if it does.
Yeah, and you just reminded me when you talked about win-win, just one thing that we talked about was, and now when I refer to it as value engineering and value analysis, VAVE, which is a very automotive kind of term, but the concept is the same, where you're really working closely with the supplier. And again, this can be direct materials, it can be indirect services as well, to look and say, okay, how can we make efficiencies in the process? How can we change and manage the cost to serve to mitigate some of these increases? Because you may be doing things that are making it more expensive for a supplier to serve you versus what it costs them to serve one of your competitors, just because of things that you don't really realize are adding additional costs that may be nice to have versus you actually need them. Yeah. So, having those sit downs, and again, it's protecting the margins, like you said before, of the supplier, but it's helping you find ways of, again, mitigating those increases. You can do that. I mean, I've seen this done where you do it with your supplier, where they can then actually take those learnings and apply them to some of their other clients. And so there's a benefit and a value in that for them, because if they do that, there's probably more chance that they'll be able to capture more of the value when they implement it with one of your competitors, once they've worked with you on efficiencies and opportunities like that. So that was just the last thing that we talked about.
Absolutely. And, it takes me back to an example that Herman Lancer shared in the plenary session from Air France, where he talked about the downtime waiting for a part for an aircraft. And actually they'd looked with the supplier about the route that part took. It was from Australia to America. And actually Air France was flying planes there. So actually they could put it into one of their planes and get it where it was needed a lot quicker. And, that took a lot of cost out of the process. So just sitting down with the supplier and being very systematic about the way things are done can really reap benefits in terms of cost as well. So you're quite right. That approach is really helpful.
All right. Well, we're going to leave it there for this week, Helen. Thank you so much for joining me on the pod and for sharing some of our findings and experiences and some of the conversations that we shared at ProcureCon EU a couple of weeks ago.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Phil. Thanks for having me on.
All right. And for anybody who's listening, any links that we discussed today, you can find those in the show notes. As always, it's artofprocurement.com/podcast, and you'll find this podcast along with all the other podcasts that we publish each week. So just go right there for more information. And of course, we'll be back, as always, same time, same place next week. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you again soon. If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.